The autumn wind carried more than just the scent of dying leaves that October morning in 1887. It carried the sound of labored breathing, barely audible above the rushing waters of Willow Creek. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Clarke almost missed it entirely as she knelt by the water's edge, scrubbing her worn calico dress against the smooth river stones. The fabric had seen better days, much like everything else in her life, but she couldn't afford to replace it. Not when every penny counted towards surviving another brutal Montana winter. She paused, her hands stilling in the icy water, and listened. There it was again, a soft, pained exhale that didn't belong to any animal she knew. Emma's heart quickened as she rose, water dripping from her reddened hands, and followed the sound upstream. What she discovered behind a cluster of fallen logs would change everything she thought she knew about survival, kindness, and the true meaning of wealth. Emma Clarke had learned to measure her days not in hours, but in the small victories that kept despair from swallowing her whole. Today's victory was finding 3 eggs in the henhouse instead of the usual 2. Tomorrow's challenge would be making them last until she could afford to buy grain for the chickens again. Such was the mathematics of poverty in Pine Ridge, Montana territory, where winter arrived early and mercy came scarce. Her cabin sat like a weathered scar on the landscape, 2 miles from the nearest neighbor and 4 from town. The isolation hadn't been her choice initially. When she'd arrived with her late husband Robert 2 years prior, they'd dreams of prosperity, of fertile soil and abundant harvests. The land agent in Denver had painted pictures with his words, describing rolling meadows perfect for crops and livestock, grazing as far as the eye could see. What he'd failed to mention was that the soil turned to concrete under the relentless sun, that the nearest water source was a temperamental creek that dried to a trickle by midsummer, and that the winter winds could strip paint from barn siding. Robert had died that first winter, not from disease or accident, but from something far more insidious. He'd simply given up. Emma had watched the light fade from his eyes as surely as if someone had snuffed out a candle day by day, disappointment by disappointment. The pneumonia that took him in February had been merely the final blow to a spirit already broken by the weight of failed dreams and mounting debts. Now, 10 months later, Emma faced each sunrise with a determination that bordered on stubbornness. She'd buried her husband beneath the lone oak tree behind the cabin, and with him she'd buried the luxury of surrender. The land might be harsh, the isolation might gnaw at her sanity during the endless winter nights, but she would not be driven from what little remained of her life. The town of Pine Ridge offered no comfort. The residents regarded her with a mixture of pity and suspicion that made every trip for supplies an exercise in enduring whispered conversations and sideways glances. They saw a woman alone, struggling to maintain a homestead that any sensible person would have abandoned months ago. Some, like Martha Wells, who ran the boarding house, showed genuine concern. Others, particularly those associated with Thomas Henley's expanding cattle empire, viewed her predicament as an opportunity. Henley had made his intentions clear during their last encounter at the general store 3 weeks prior. He'd cornered her near the sacks of flour, his expensive suit and polished boots a stark contrast to her patched dress and worn boots. His offer had been delivered with the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, wrapped in false concern and thinly veiled threats. "Mrs. Clarke," he'd said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I hear you're having a difficult time making ends meet out there. It's no shame, mind you. That land has broken stronger folks than yourself." Emma had continued examining, the flour sacks refusing to meet his eyes, She'd learned that engaging with Henley only encouraged him, and she had neither the energy nor the inclination for another of his carefully rehearsed speeches about the folly of a woman trying to manage a homestead alone. "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer," he'd continued, undeterred by her silence. $500 cash, right here and now. That's more than enough to start fresh somewhere more suitable for a lady of your circumstances. The amount would have solved her immediate problems, she knew. It would have covered her debts, purchased passage to California where her sister lived, and left enough for a modest new beginning. But Emma also knew that $500 was a fraction of what the land would be worth once Henley connected it to his vast grazing operation. She wasn't naive about his motivations. "The land isn't for sale, Mr. Henley," she'd replied quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. His expression had hardened then, the mask of civility slipping just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "That's unfortunate, Mrs. Clarke. This territory can be dangerous for someone in your position." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Accidents happen, equipment fails. Sometimes help doesn't arrive when it's needed most. The threat had been delivered with the same casual tone he might use to comment on the weather. Emma had gathered her few purchases and left without another word, but Henley's message had been clear. He wanted her land, and her cooperation was preferable, but not required. In the days that followed, Emma had noticed subtle signs of interference. Her water pump had been tampered with, requiring hours of work to repair. Fence posts had been mysteriously loosened, allowing her few remaining chickens to wander into the brush, where foxes claimed 2 of them. A careful inventory of her supply shed revealed missing tools, items too specific to have been taken by casual thieves. The harassment might have broken someone else, but Emma discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Each act of sabotage only strengthened her resolve to remain. She reinforced her defenses, checking and rechecking equipment for signs of tampering. She slept lightly, keeping Robert's old rifle within arm's reach. Most importantly, she refused to show fear, even when Jake Morrison, Henley's foreman, made a point of riding slowly past her cabin at odd hours, his presence a constant reminder of the forces arrayed against her. The isolation that had once seemed like a burden became her shield. Out here, away from the town's judgmental eyes and Henley's immediate influence, she could focus on the essential tasks of survival. She preserved what vegetables her struggling garden had produced, repaired what could be mended, and prepared as best she could for the winter that would test every skill she'd acquired over the past year. Her nearest neighbor, Martha Wells' nephew David, lived 3 miles to the east, but he was young and had his own struggles with a new wife and failing crops. The trading post was closer, but old Pete Garrison, who ran it, had made it clear that his sympathy extended only as far as his profit margins. Credit was available only to those who could guarantee payment, and Emma's guarantees were worth little in Pine Ridge's harsh economy. This was her reality on that October morning as she made her way to Willow Creek with her washing. The routine had become meditation, the rhythmic scrubbing against the stones, a way to quiet the constant calculations of survival that occupied her mind. How many eggs could she spare to trade for flour? How much firewood would she need to gather before the first snow? Could she make her lamp oil last another month if she went to bed earlier and rose later? The creek itself provided a small measure of peace. Unlike everything else in her world, the water asked nothing of her, demanded no payment, offered no judgment. It simply flowed, constant and reliable, carrying her troubles downstream, even if only temporarily. She'd discovered that her best thinking happened here, beside the gentle murmur of water over stones, where the weight of her circumstances seemed somehow more manageable. That was why the sound of labored breathing struck her so forcefully. In this place of solitude, any human presence was startling, but the quality of those pained exhalations suggested something far more serious than a fellow settler seeking water or rest. Emma's first instinct was caution. In her current circumstances, any stranger could represent either salvation or threat, and she'd learned to assume the latter until proven otherwise. But as she followed the sound upstream, stepping carefully on the slippery stones, something deeper than caution compelled her forward. Perhaps it was the memory of Robert's final days, when his breathing had carried that same desperate quality. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that whoever lay ahead was even more vulnerable than she was, a distinction that required considerable suffering in her current world. The man she discovered behind the fallen logs was unlike anyone she'd ever encountered. His skin, where it wasn't darkened by dried blood, was the deep bronze of someone who lived entirely under the open sky. His hair, black as coal and longer than any white man would wear, was matted with mud and debris from his ordeal. But it was his clothing that marked him unmistakably as Cheyenne, the beadwork and leather craftsmanship speaking of a culture she knew only through fearful whispers in town and sensationalized newspaper accounts. He lay motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest, his breathing so faint that Emma had to kneel close to confirm he was still alive. Blood seeped from multiple wounds, staining the earth beneath him a dark crimson. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and a deep gash across his forehead had left half his face masked in dried blood. Emma's mind raced through the implications of her discovery. Finding an injured Cheyenne warrior on her land placed her in immediate danger, not from the man himself, who was clearly in no condition to threaten anyone, but from the complex web of tensions that defined relations between the white settlers and native tribes. The Indian Wars were officially over, but conflicts still erupted regularly, and any association with the Cheyenne could brand her as a sympathizer or worse. She knew what most people in Pine Ridge would do. They'd either walk away and pretend they'd seen nothing, or they'd notify Sheriff Coleman and let him handle the situation according to territorial law. Neither option sat well with Emma's conscience, but the practical considerations were undeniable. Helping this man could bring down upon her the very forces she was already struggling to resist. As she knelt there, torn between self-preservation and compassion, the injured man's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and despite his condition, they fixed on her with an intensity that made her catch her breath. There was no fear in those eyes, no pleading for mercy. Instead, she saw a calm acceptance that spoke of a man who had faced death before and made his peace with it. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two people from different worlds brought together by circumstance and desperation. Emma saw intelligence in his gaze and something else that surprised her, a recognition of her own struggle, as if he could read in her face the same hardships that had carved lines around his eyes. The moments stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Here was a man who had lived his entire life as an outsider in his own land, driven from place to place by forces beyond his control. Here was a woman who had become an outsider in her adopted home, fighting daily to maintain her place against those who would see her gone. In their shared vulnerability, they found an unexpected connection that transcended the supposed boundaries of race and culture. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "You're hurt badly. I can help you, but I need to get you to my cabin." The man's lips moved, but no sound emerged. He tried again, managing only a whisper in a language she didn't understand. But his meaning was clear enough in the slight nod he managed, the acceptance of her offer, despite whatever it might cost him. Emma knew that the decision she was about to make would change everything. Helping this man would require her to choose Compassion over caution, humanity over self-preservation. It would place her in conflict with the very people whose acceptance she'd been trying to earn. And it might well provide Thomas Henley with the excuse he'd been seeking to remove her from her land permanently. But as she looked into those dark eyes, seeing reflected there the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had carried her through the past year, Emma realized that some choices made themselves. She couldn't walk away from suffering when she had the power to alleviate it, regardless of the consequences. Her humanity demanded more of her than her circumstances might permit, and she would answer that demand, whatever the cost. The injured. Cheyenne Hunter had arrived at her creek not as an invader or enemy, but as a fellow soul in need of mercy. And mercy, Emma decided, was the one thing she could still afford to give freely, even when everything else in her life came at a price. She could barely manage to pay. Moving the injured Cheyenne warrior proved more challenging than Emma had anticipated. Despite his unconscious state, he was considerably larger than she'd initially realized. His frame lean but muscular from a lifetime of physical demands she could only imagine. The broken leg complicated every movement, requiring her to fashion a makeshift stretcher from her washing basket and the planks she'd been saving to repair her chicken coop. The journey from the creek to her cabin stretched over 2 grueling hours. Emma was forced to stop frequently, not only to rest her aching muscles, but to check that her patient was still breathing. Each pause brought fresh worry that he might slip away before she could provide proper care, and with each labored breath he drew, she felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily upon her shoulders. By the time she managed to drag him onto her cabin's narrow porch, Emma's dress was soaked with perspiration despite the cool autumn air. Her hands, already roughened by months of hard labor, were now torn and bleeding from gripping the improvised stretcher. But the most difficult part lay ahead. Getting him inside would require lifting his full weight, and Emma wasn't certain her strength would prove sufficient. She wedged open her cabin door and studied the space within. The single room that served as her kitchen, parlor, and bedroom suddenly seemed impossibly cramped. Her narrow bed, built for one person, would barely accommodate the injured man's frame. The rough-hewn floor, which she'd grown accustomed to, now appeared inadequate for housing someone in such critical condition. With considerable effort and several false starts, Emma managed to half-carry, half-drag the unconscious man to her bed. The exertion left her dizzy and nauseated, but there was no time for rest. Blood continued to seep from his wounds, staining her carefully maintained quilt and pooling on the floor beneath. If she was going to save his life, she needed to act immediately. Emma had tended injuries before, mostly minor cuts and burns sustained during farm work, but nothing approaching the severity of what lay before her. The head wound alone was enough to kill a man if infection set in, and the broken leg required knowledge she simply didn't possess. Her medical supplies consisted of a small bottle of whiskey, some clean rags, needle and thread, and a jar of honey her late husband had claimed possessed healing properties. She began with the head wound, gently cleaning away the dried blood with warm water and soft cloth. The gash extended from his left temple to his cheekbone, deep enough that she could see bone beneath the torn flesh. As she worked, she found herself studying his features more closely than propriety should have allowed. His face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent countless days under sun and wind, but there was something noble about the strong jaw and high cheekbones that spoke of dignity maintained despite hardship. The cleaning process roused him briefly from unconsciousness. His eyes opened suddenly, focusing on her face with such intensity that Emma nearly dropped her cloth. For a moment, she saw confusion there, perhaps wondering if he had crossed into the spirit world, and she was some otherworldly being sent to guide him. Then recognition dawned, and with it, a wariness that made her realize how vulnerable her position truly was. Despite his injuries, this man was still capable of overpowering her if he chose to do so. She was alone, miles from help, tending to someone whose people were often portrayed as savage and unpredictable. Every newspaper account, every whispered story in town had painted the Cheyenne as ruthless warriors who showed no mercy to white settlers. Yet as she looked into his eyes, Emma saw pain and exhaustion rather than hostility. "You're safe," she said softly, not knowing if he understood English, but hoping her tone would convey her peaceful intentions. "I'm going to help you." He studied her face for several seconds, his gaze moving from her eyes to her hands, which were gentle, despite their roughness, then back to her eyes again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The simple gesture carried enormous weight, an acknowledgement of trust that seemed to bridge the vast cultural divide between them. Emma resumed her ministrations with increased confidence. She cleaned each wound methodically, fighting back nausea when she discovered the full extent of his injuries. Besides the head wound and broken leg, his torso bore several deep gashes that suggested he'd been mauled by a large animal, possibly a bear. His right shoulder showed signs of dislocation, and numerous smaller cuts and bruises covered his arms. And back, the whiskey served multiple purposes, first as an antiseptic for the wounds, then as pain relief when consciousness returned to torment him. Emma had never seen anyone endure such agony with such stoic composure. When she set his dislocated shoulder, his body went rigid and sweat beaded on his forehead, but he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. As she worked, Emma found herself talking to him, partly to fill the silence and partly because she sensed he was listening even when his eyes were closed. She told him about her struggles with the farm, about Robert's death, about Thomas Henley's harassment. She spoke of her loneliness and her determination to remain on land that seemed determined to reject her presence. "I suppose we're both fighting the same battle in different ways," she said, as she stitched the worst of his wounds. "Trying to survive in a place that doesn't want us here." His eyes opened at this, fixing on her face with what might have been surprise. Perhaps he hadn't expected such understanding from a white woman, or perhaps he recognized the truth in her words. Either way, something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared experience that transcended their different backgrounds. The sun was setting by the time Emma finished tending his injuries. Exhaustion weighed on her, like a heavy blanket, but she couldn't afford to rest yet. Her patient needed food if he was going to recover, and she needed to consider the practical implications of harboring a wounded Cheyenne warrior in her cabin. She prepared a thin broth from the last of her salt pork and vegetables, adding herbs she'd gathered from the creek bank that were supposed to promote healing. The aroma filled the small cabin, a comforting smell that reminded her of better times when Robert was alive, and the future seemed full of possibility rather than daily struggle. When she tried to feed him the broth, he initially resisted, turning his head away with the stubborn pride of someone unaccustomed to helplessness. Emma persisted gently, explaining that he needed nourishment to heal, that his body required fuel to fight off infection and mend the damaged tissue. "You can't help your people if you're dead," she said practically, "and I can't help you if you won't let me." This argument seemed to reach him where gentler persuasion had failed. He allowed her to spoon small amounts of broth between his lips, swallowing with obvious effort. The process was slow and exhausting for both of them, but Emma felt a quiet satisfaction as color began to return to his pallid complexion. As night fell, Emma faced a dilemma she hadn't fully considered earlier. Her cabin contained only one bed, which her patient now occupied, and the floor was too cold and hard for someone of her age to sleep on comfortably. More importantly, she needed to remain close enough to monitor his condition throughout the night, to ensure that fever didn't set in or that his wounds didn't reopen. She finally arranged blankets on the floor beside the bed, close enough to hear any change in his breathing, but far enough to maintain some semblance of propriety. The arrangement felt strange and intimate in ways that made her uncomfortable. But practicality overruled social conventions in circumstances like these. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by her patient's occasional moans and the need to check his temperature and change his bandages. During one of these nocturnal ministrations, Emma discovered him watching her work by the flickering lamplight. His gaze was clear and alert, more focused than it had been during the day. "What's your name?" she asked quietly, not expecting an answer, but feeling the need to establish some form of communication beyond their wordless understanding. "Running Bear," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough that she understood. "I'm Emma," she replied, "Emma Clarke." He repeated her name carefully, as if testing the unfamiliar syllables. The sound of her name in his accent made it seem exotic and new, transformed by his pronunciation into something that belonged to this strange new world they were creating together in her small cabin. "Why do you help me?" Running Bear asked, his English heavily accented but comprehensible. Emma considered the question seriously. She could have offered easy answers about Christian charity or simple human decency, but something in his direct gaze demanded honesty. "Because you needed help," she said finally, "and because I know what it's like to be alone and hurt with nowhere to turn." Running Bear studied her face in the lamplight, perhaps seeing there the same hardships and disappointments that had marked his own life. When he spoke again, his voice carried a formality that suggested he was offering something precious. "My people have words for such kindness. You risk much for stranger." "So do you," Emma replied, trusting a white woman, "when your people have every reason to distrust us. You are not like others," Running Bear said with conviction that surprised her. "How can you know that? You've barely met me." "Eyes tell truth," he said simply. "Your eyes show pain but also strength. Show kindness without weakness. My grandmother taught me to read such things." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as Emma changed his bandages and checked his wounds for signs of infection. The intimacy of caring for him had become less awkward as the hours passed, replaced by the focused attention of someone determined to preserve life regardless of social conventions. As dawn approached, Emma realized that her decision to help Running Bear had already changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The isolation that had been her burden was now shared. The loneliness that had threatened to consume her was held at bay by his presence. She had spent so many months focused on mere survival that she had forgotten the satisfaction that came from nurturing and healing. But beyond her personal transformation, Emma sensed that she had stumbled into something much larger than her individual circumstances. Running Bear was clearly a man of importance among his people, his bearing and demeanor suggesting leadership and respect. His presence in her cabin represented a bridge between worlds that were supposedly irreconcilable, a connection that could have profound implications for both their futures. The morning brought new challenges and revelations. Running Bear's fever broke just before sunrise, and with it came increased lucidity and strength. He was able to sit up without assistance, to take more substantial nourishment, and to engage in longer conversations that revealed the intelligence and wisdom Emma had sensed from their first encounter. He told her about the bear attack that had left him wounded and stranded miles from his people. He had been hunting alone, tracking a wounded elk when he'd surprised a female grizzly with cubs. The encounter had been brief but devastating, leaving him battered and lost in unfamiliar territory. He'd wandered for 2 days before collapsing by her creek, certain that he would die alone and unmourned. "My son will think I abandoned him," Running Bear said, pain evident in his voice. "Young Crow waits for my return, but I cannot travel yet." Emma learned that Running Bear was a widower like herself, that his wife had died in a cavalry attack on their village 3 years earlier. He had been raising his teenage son alone, teaching him the skills and wisdom necessary to survive in a world that grew more hostile toward their people each year. "We are the same, you and I," Emma said, recognizing the parallel in their situations, both trying to protect what we love most while the world tries to take it from us. Running Bear nodded gravely. "Yes, both fighting to remain when others wish us gone." As his strength returned, Running Bear insisted on contributing to his own care and to the maintenance of Emma's homestead. Despite his injuries, he possessed knowledge and skills that proved invaluable. He showed her how to set more effective snares for rabbits and other small game, how to identify edible plants that grew wild near the creek, and how to preserve meat in ways that would extend her winter supplies significantly. His presence also brought an unexpected sense of security to Emma's daily routine. Even wounded, Running Bear possessed an alertness and awareness that came from a lifetime of vigilance. He noticed things that escaped her attention, subtle signs that someone had been near the cabin during the night, tracks that suggested surveillance, sounds that indicated potential threats. "The man who troubles you," Running Bear said on the third morning. "He has been here while we sleep." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "How do you know?" "Tracks near your barn, fresh, made in darkness." He watches, waits for opportunity. The knowledge that Thomas Henley or his men had been spying on her cabin filled Emma with a mixture of fear and anger. Bad enough that they harassed her openly, but this skulking surveillance felt like a violation that went beyond their previous intimidation tactics. "He wants my land," Emma explained. "He's been trying to force me to sell. Now he has more reason," Running Bear said grimly. "White woman helping Cheyenne warrior brings anger from many." Emma realized that her decision to help Running Bear, while morally right, had indeed placed her in greater danger than before. Henley could now claim that she was consorting with hostile Indians, a charge that would turn even her few sympathizers against her. The isolation that had been her protection might now become her vulnerability. Yet as she looked at Running Bear, seeing the dignity and intelligence in his bearing, Emma felt no regret for her choice. Whatever consequences followed, she had acted according to her conscience rather than her fears. In a world that seemed determined to strip away her humanity along with her security, maintaining her capacity for compassion felt like the most important victory of all. The third day brought visitors that would test the fragile trust Emma and Running Bear had built together and would force both of them to confront the larger forces that threatened to destroy everything they were trying to protect. The sound of approaching horses reached Emma's ears just after dawn on the fourth day, their hoofbeats drumming against the hard-packed earth with a rhythm that spoke of urgency rather than casual travel. She had been tending to the fire, preparing morning coffee with the last of her precious beans, when Running Bear's sudden alertness caught her attention. Despite his injuries, he had pushed himself upright in bed, every muscle tense, with the coiled energy of a predator, sensing danger. "3 riders," he whispered, his voice carrying the certainty of someone whose survival had long depended on such observations. "Coming fast from the east." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she moved to the window, carefully pulling aside the faded calico curtain to peer through the glass. The riders were still distant, but even at this range, she could see the purposeful way they approached, their mounts eating up the ground with the steady gait of horses pushed hard, but not yet exhausted. "Is it your people?" she asked, turning back to Running Bear. He shook his head, his dark eyes never leaving the window. "No, these horses carry different burdens. White men, and they ride with anger." Emma felt her stomach clench as the implications became clear. Word of Running Bear's presence had somehow reached town, and now the consequences she had feared were riding toward her door. She thought of Sheriff Coleman, a man she barely knew, but whose reputation suggested more concern for maintaining peace than ensuring justice. She thought of Thomas Henley, whose influence extended far beyond his ranch boundaries. Most of all, she thought of Jake Morrison, Henley's foreman, whose cold eyes had promised violence during their previous encounters. "You need to hide," Emma said, her mind racing through possibilities. The cabin offered few options for concealment, and Running Bear's injuries made him nearly immobile, despite his improving condition. "No," he replied firmly. "I will not cower like wounded animal while you face danger alone." "You can barely stand," Emma protested, "and if they find you here, they'll use it as an excuse to do whatever they planned anyway." Running Bear's jaw tightened with stubborn pride. Better to die with honor than live with shame. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Emma realized there was no time for argument. She grabbed Robert's old rifle from above the fireplace, checking quickly to ensure it was loaded. The weapon felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, but its presence provided a small measure of comfort against the uncertainty ahead. The riders had reached her property line now, close enough that she could make out individual figures. Sheriff Coleman rode in the center, his tin badge catching the early morning sunlight, flanked by Jake Morrison and another man she didn't recognize. All three were armed, their rifles clearly visible in saddle holsters, and their faces carried the grim determination of men who had come to settle a matter one way or another. Emma stepped onto her porch, the rifle held across her chest in a manner that suggested readiness without outright hostility. The morning air was crisp against her skin, and she could see her breath in small puffs of vapor as she waited for the riders to close the remaining distance. Sheriff Coleman reined in his horse about 20 feet from the porch, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid any sudden movements from either side. He was a thin man in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker aspects. His presence here suggested official business, but the company he kept indicated that justice might not be his primary concern. "Morning, Mrs. Clarke," Coleman said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that carried more formality than warmth. "I'm afraid we need to have a conversation about some disturbing reports that have reached my office." Emma kept her expression neutral despite the fear coursing through her veins. "What kind of reports, Sheriff?" Jake Morrison shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually on his rifle butt. "The kind that suggest you've been harboring dangerous individuals on your property," he said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed he held winning cards. "I don't know what you mean," Emma replied, though she knew the denial sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Don't play coy with us, woman," Morrison continued. "We know you've got yourself a redskin holed up in there. Question is whether you're hiding him out of misguided charity, or if there's something more sinister going on." Sheriff Coleman held up a hand to silence his companion, though his eyes never left Emma's face. "Mrs. Clarke, I'm going to ask you directly, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Are you currently providing shelter to a Cheyenne warrior?" Emma felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her like a physical force. The easy lie waited on her tongue, the simple denial that might send these men away and preserve the fragile safety she had built. But as she stood there, rifle in hand and conscience at war with pragmatism, she realized that some truths could not be hidden indefinitely. "I'm providing medical care to an injured man," she said carefully. "The same care I would provide to anyone who needed it." Morrison's eyes glittered with triumph. "So you admit it. You're harboring a hostile Indian on your property, providing aid and comfort to enemies of civilized folk." "He's not an enemy," Emma said, her voice gaining strength. "He's a human being who was injured and needed help." "Human being?" Disha, third rider, whom Emma now recognized as Pete Garrison from the trading post, spat into the dust. "These savages ain't human, woman. They're animals that need to be put down before they can hurt decent folk. Sheriff Coleman looked uncomfortable with his companion's rhetoric, but he made no move to restrain them. Mrs. Clarke, you need to understand the position you've put yourself in. Relations with the local tribes are delicate right now, and harboring armed warriors could be seen as an act of hostility against the territorial government. He's unarmed and barely able to stand, Emma protested. He poses no threat to anyone. That's not for you to decide, Morrison said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. We'll need to inspect your property and remove this individual to proper custody. Emma raised her rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at the men, but making her intentions clear. You're not coming into my home without proper legal authority. Sheriff Coleman sighed, reaching into his jacket to produce a folded paper. I'm afraid I do have proper authority, Mrs. Clarke. This is a warrant to search these premises for illegal weapons and hostile individuals. The document looked official enough, though Emma suspected its legality was questionable at best. She knew that challenging it would require resources and influence she didn't possess, and the men before her were clearly prepared to enforce their will regardless of legal niceties. This is my property, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, and that man is under my protection. Morrison laughed harshly. Your protection? Lady, you can't even protect yourself. Mr. Henley's been more than patient with your situation, but this changes everything. Consorting with hostiles puts you beyond the pale of civilized society. Thomas Henley has no authority here, Emma said, though she knew the statement was more wishful thinking than reality. Mr. Henley has authority wherever decent folk need protection from savage elements, Garrison interjected, and right now, that includes your property. Sheriff Coleman looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but he seemed powerless to control his companions. Mrs. Clarke, if you cooperate fully, we can handle this matter with minimal disruption. If you resist, I can't guarantee your safety or that of your guest. The threat was clear enough, wrapped though it was in official language. Emma realized that her options had dwindled to accepting the violation of her home or fighting men who were better armed and more numerous than she was. Neither choice offered much hope for protecting Running Bear or preserving her own independence. From inside the cabin came a sound that changed everything. Running Bear's voice, speaking in his own language, carried a tone of command that seemed to fill the morning air with authority. Emma didn't understand the words, but their effect on the three men was immediately apparent. Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, while Garrison actually took a step backward from his horse. "What's he saying?" Coleman demanded, his previous composure cracking slightly. Emma had no idea, but she sensed that Running Bear was taking control of a situation that had spiraled beyond her ability to manage. The cabin door opened, and despite his injuries, Running Bear emerged onto the porch with a dignity that made the three armed men seem suddenly diminished. He wore only his leather leggings and a blanket Emma had provided, his torso still bandaged from his wounds, but his bearing was that of a chief addressing subordinates rather than a prisoner facing captors. When he spoke again, it was in heavily accented but clear English. "I am Running Bear of the Northern Cheyenne. This woman has shown honor by caring for my wounds. You will not harm her." Morrison's face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "You're in no position to make demands, Redskin. You're on white land, and you'll submit to white justice." Running Bear's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Morrison's bravado sound hollow. "This woman's kindness has earned my protection. Any harm to her will be answered by my people." "Your people are scattered and broken," Garrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They can't protect anybody." "Can they not?" Running Bear asked mildly. "Perhaps you should. Look behind you before making such claims. All three men turned, and Emma followed their gaze to see riders emerging from the tree line that bordered her property to the north. At first, there were only 3 or 4 figures, but as they moved into the open, their numbers became clear. 24 Cheyenne warriors sat their horses in perfect silence, their weapons visible but not yet threatening, their presence transforming the morning's confrontation into something far more complex and dangerous. Sheriff Coleman's face went pale as he realized how quickly the situation had escalated beyond his control. These were not scattered refugees or broken remnants of a defeated people, but disciplined warriors who had moved with the stealth and coordination of a military unit. Their arrival suggested planning and intelligence that challenged every assumption the white men had made about Indian capabilities. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. The lead warrior, a man whose bearing suggested high rank among his people, urged his horse forward until he was close enough for conversation. His face was painted with symbols Emma didn't recognize, and his weapons were clearly ceremonial as well as functional. When he spoke, it was in the same commanding tone Running Bear had used, but his words were directed at his fellow Cheyenne. Running Bear responded in their shared language, and Emma caught the rhythm of formal speech as if protocols were being observed that went far beyond the immediate crisis. Whatever was being said seemed to satisfy the lead warrior, who nodded gravely before addressing the white men in English that was more fluent than Running Bear's. "I am Chief White Eagle of the Northern Cheyenne. Running Bear is my war leader and the father of my grandson. This woman has shown great honor by preserving his life, and by doing so has earned the protection of our people." Sheriff Coleman. He found his voice, though it trembled slightly. "Chief, I appreciate your position, but this is a matter of territorial law. We have jurisdiction here." White Eagle's expression remained impassive. "Your law did not save Running Bear's life. This woman's courage did. By our law, she is now under our protection, and any who harm her will answer to the Cheyenne Nation." "You can't just claim a white woman as your responsibility," Morrison protested, though he kept his distance from the mounted warriors. "We claim nothing," White Eagle replied. "We honor a debt. Running Bear lives because of her kindness. Our people will remember this always." Emma realized that something profound was happening, something that went far, beyond the immediate confrontation over Running Bear's presence in her cabin. The formal language, the ceremonial bearing of the warriors, the careful protocols being observed, all suggested that her simple act of compassion had triggered cultural mechanisms she couldn't fully understand. Running Bear spoke again to his chief, gesturing toward Emma with obvious respect. White Eagle listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that prompted longer explanations. Finally, the chief nodded and addressed Emma directly. "Running Bear tells me you have enemies among your own people, men who would steal your land and drive you from your home." Emma glanced at Morrison and Garrison, both of whom were studying the ground rather than meeting anyone's eyes. "Yes," she said simply, "these same men would use his presence here to justify their actions against you." "I believe so. Yes." White Eagle considered this information gravely. "Then we must ensure that his presence brings you protection rather than danger. Running Bear, are you strong enough to travel?" "I am strong enough to do what honor requires," Running Bear replied. The chief nodded and turned back to Emma. "We will take Running Bear to heal among his own people, so that your enemies cannot use his presence against you. But know this, woman whose heart is generous, you have earned the friendship of the Cheyenne. We do not forget such debts." "Sheriff." Coleman cleared his throat nervously. "Chief, I appreciate your position, but I still have a legal obligation here." "Your legal obligation is to maintain peace," White Eagle replied calmly. "Will peace be better served by honoring the woman who saved a life, or by delivering her to those who would harm her for showing mercy?" The question hung in the morning. air like a challenge that went far beyond the immediate situation. Emma realized that she was witnessing a confrontation between two different concepts of justice, two different ways of understanding honor and obligation. Morrison started to speak, but Sheriff Coleman silenced him with a sharp gesture. The sheriff's face showed the strain of a man caught between competing authorities, knowing that his next words might determine whether the morning ended in peace or bloodshed. "I believe," Coleman said carefully, "that my primary obligation is to ensure the safety of all territorial residents. If Chief White Eagle can guarantee that taking Running Bear will eliminate any threat to Mrs. Clarke's safety, then perhaps we can resolve this matter without further complications." White Eagle's expression suggested approval of the sheriff's diplomatic approach. "Running Bear will come with us willingly. But understand this. Any future harm to this woman will be seen as an act of war against the Cheyenne people." The warning was delivered without heat or bluster, but its sincerity was unmistakable. Emma felt a strange mixture of gratitude and bewilderment at finding herself under the protection of people she had known nothing about just days before. Running Bear approached her then, moving carefully but with obvious determination. When he spoke, his voice carried formal cadences that suggested he was following cultural protocols as important as anything White Eagle had observed. "Emma Clarke, you have given me my life when you could have left me to die. By Cheyenne law, this creates obligations that cannot be ignored. You are now sister to my people, protected by our strength, honored by our respect." Emma felt tears pricking at her eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected consequences of what had seemed like simple human decency. "I only did what anyone should do." "No," Running Bear said firmly, "you did what few would do. The difference will not be forgotten." As the Cheyenne prepared to depart, taking Running Bear with them despite his obvious reluctance to leave, Emma unprotected, Chief White Eagle approached her one final time. "Your enemies believe they have won by driving us away," he said quietly. "Let them believe this, but know that Cheyenne eyes will watch over you, and Cheyenne justice will answer any who bring you harm." The words were spoken so softly that only Emma could hear them, but they carried a weight of commitment that made her understand she had crossed a threshold into a larger world than she had ever imagined. Her simple act of compassion had created connections and obligations that would reshape not just her own future, but the delicate balance of power in the entire territory. As the warriors rode away with Running Bear supported between two of their number, Emma stood on her porch watching until they disappeared into the morning distance. Sheriff Coleman and his companions followed shortly after, their mission accomplished, but their authority somehow diminished by the morning's events. Emma was alone again, but the isolation felt different now. She had proven to herself and others that her compassion was stronger than her fear, that her humanity could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided people into categories of us and them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the knowledge that kindness, even when it seemed foolish or dangerous, could create connections that no amount of force could sever. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the autumn air and casting long shadows across her property. Emma went back inside her cabin, which felt strangely empty without Running Bear's presence, and began the process of cleaning and organizing that would erase the physical evidence of his stay. But she knew that the changes he had brought to her life, and she to his, would endure long after all traces of his presence had been swept away. The 2 weeks following Running Bear's departure passed with deceptive tranquility that left Emma more unsettled than open hostility would have. Thomas Henley's usual harassment had ceased entirely, his riders no longer making their threatening passes by her cabin, his foreman Jake Morrison nowhere to be seen on the roads between her homestead and town. Even her trips to Pine Ridge for essential supplies proceeded without incident, the townspeople treating her with the same mixture of pity and indifference they had shown before Running Bear's arrival. This sudden peace felt more ominous than reassuring. Emma had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the stillness that preceded violent storms, and she sensed gathering forces beyond her ability to see or predict. Her daily routines continued unchanged, tending her few remaining chickens, maintaining her cabin against the approaching winter, preserving what food she could gather or trap. But beneath these mundane activities ran a current of tension that made her sleep fitfully and start at unexpected sounds. The first indication that her respite was ending came on a grey October morning when Martha Wells appeared at her door, her usually composed face etched with worry lines that seemed to have deepened overnight. Martha rarely ventured so far from town, and her presence at Emma's isolated cabin suggested news too important or dangerous to trust to casual conversation at the general store. "Emma, dear," Martha said without preamble, "you need to know what's been happening in town. There's talk, ugly talk, and it's getting worse every day." Emma invited her neighbor inside, grateful for human company despite the ominous nature of Martha's visit. The older woman accepted coffee with trembling hands, her agitation evident in every gesture as she struggled to find words for what she had witnessed. "It started right after those Indians took their man away," Martha began. "Henley's been holding meetings, private ones, with men from all over the territory. They're not just talking about your land anymore, Emma. They're talking about making an example, about showing what happens to white folks who consort with savages." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through her cabin's thin walls. "What kind of example?" Martha's face went pale. "The burning kind, the kind that leaves nothing but ash and memory." The words hit Emma like physical blows, confirming her worst fears about the consequences of her compassion. She had known that helping Running Bear would bring retaliation, but she had imagined harassment, legal challenges, perhaps forced eviction. The possibility of violence on the scale Martha described had seemed too extreme even for men like Henley and Morrison. "When?" Emma asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Soon. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow." Pete Garrison let slip that they're waiting for some signal, some excuse to make it look justified rather than just murder. Martha leaned forward, grasping Emma's hands with desperate intensity. "You have to leave, dear. Pack what you can carry and get as far from here as possible." Emma stared into the fire, crackling in her small hearth, watching the flames dance in patterns that reminded her of Running Bear's stories about his grandmother's prophecies. The thought of abandoning everything she had worked to build, of letting Thomas Henley's greed triumph through intimidation and violence, filled her with a stubborn anger that surprised her with its intensity. "This is my home," she said quietly. "Robert is buried here. Everything I have left in the world is here." "Everything you have won't matter if you're dead," Martha replied sharply. "These men aren't playing games, Emma. They've convinced themselves that you're some kind of traitor to your own race, and they mean to make you pay for it." Emma understood the logic of Martha's argument, but something deeper than logic kept her rooted to her chair. Perhaps it was the memory of Running Bear's dignified refusal to cower when faced with superior force. Perhaps it was the realization that running would validate every cruel assumption her enemies had made about her weakness and unsuitability for frontier life. Or perhaps it was simply the accumulated weight of too many losses, too many retreats, too many compromises with injustice. "I can't run," she said finally. "Not anymore." Martha's expression shifted from urgency to something approaching despair. "Then you're choosing to die. And for what? A piece of land that's barely worth farming and a principle that won't matter when you're in the ground?" "Maybe," Emma admitted, "but if I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life running. There has to be a place where a person makes a stand, where they say, "No further," and mean it. Martha argued for another hour, painting vivid pictures of the violence that awaited Emma if she remained, describing the men who had joined Henley's cause and their capacity for cruelty. But Emma's resolve only hardened with each dire prediction, strengthened by the growing certainty that some battles were worth fighting regardless of their outcome. After Martha departed, shaking her head in frustrated defeat, Emma began her preparations with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had accepted the worst possible outcome. She cleaned and loaded Robert's rifle, checking the mechanism multiple times to ensure it would function when needed. She gathered what ammunition she possessed, a pitifully small collection that would not sustain a prolonged fight but might serve for one decisive confrontation. More importantly, she wrote letters, a brief note to her sister in California, explaining her choices and asking forgiveness for the pain her decisions might cause. A longer letter to Martha Wells, thanking her for friendship and requesting that she see to Emma's burial beside Robert if events warranted such attention. Finally, a message she hoped would never need to be delivered, addressed to Chief White Eagle and the Northern Cheyenne, explaining what had happened and absolving them of any responsibility for her fate. As evening approached, Emma found herself drawn repeatedly to her small window, scanning the horizon for signs of approaching riders. The landscape that had once seemed so hostile now felt protective, its familiar rhythms and seasonal changes a comfort against the uncertainty ahead. She thought of Running Bear recovering among his people, of the dignity he had maintained even when facing men who saw him as less than human, and she drew strength from his example. The attack came not with the dramatic thunder of many horses, but with the stealthy approach of men who understood the value of surprise. Emma first became aware of their presence when her chickens began squawking in alarm, their agitation carrying clearly through the still night air. She extinguished her lamp immediately, plunging the cabin into darkness that might conceal her movements while her eyes adjusted to the moonlit landscape outside. From her window, she could see shadowy figures moving with practiced coordination around her property. They had positioned themselves to cut off escape routes while maintaining clear fields of fire toward her cabin. The tactical sophistication of their approach suggested military experience, or at least careful planning, confirming that this was no spontaneous outburst of vigilante justice, but a calculated execution. Thomas Henley's voice carried clearly, across the night air, amplified by the confidence of a man who believed victory was assured. "Mrs. Clarke, we know you're in there. Come out peacefully, and we can discuss this situation like civilized people." Emma almost laughed at the absurdity of the invitation. Men who surrounded a woman's home under cover of darkness, armed and ready for violence, were hardly interested in civilized discussion, but she recognized the performance for what it was, the ritual of offering mercy that would allow them to claim self-defense when she inevitably refused. "I'm on my own property, Mr. Henley," she called back. "If you want to discuss anything, you can come back during daylight hours and knock on my door like a gentleman." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Henley replied. "You see, we have credible reports that you're harboring weapons intended for hostile Indians. That makes you a threat to territorial security, and we're authorized to search your premises by any means necessary." The lie was so brazen that Emma felt her anger override her fear. These men had convinced themselves that any fabrication was justified by their cause, that her defiance of their authority granted them license for any atrocity they chose to commit. "The only weapons I have are legal ones, used for hunting and protection," she responded, "and you have no authority to search anything." Jake Morrison's harsh laughter punctuated the night. "Lady, we're the only authority that matters out here. Now stop wasting our time and come out before we lose patience." Emma moved away from the window, positioning herself behind her overturned table where she would have some protection from incoming fire. Her rifle lay across the wooden surface, its familiar weight providing meager comfort against the overwhelming odds she faced. She had perhaps 20 rounds of ammunition, enough for a brief but decisive engagement if her aim proved true. The waiting stretched into an eternity measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. Emma could hear the men repositioning themselves, their whispered conversations carrying fragments of planning and coordination. They were taking their time, savoring the anticipation of victory over someone they had branded as traitor and outcast. When the first shot exploded through her window, shattering glass and sending splinters flying across her cabin, Emma realized that the time for negotiation had passed. These men had come not to arrest or intimidate, but to kill, and her survival now depended entirely on her ability to fight back effectively. She returned fire immediately, aiming at the muzzle flash that had revealed the shooter's position. The rifle's recoil jarred her shoulder, but she heard a cry of pain that suggested her shot had found its mark. The sound galvanized the attackers, and suddenly the night erupted in gunfire that turned her cabin into a target for concentrated violence. Bullets splintered her door, shattered her remaining windows, and punched through the thin walls with devastating effect. Emma crouched behind her makeshift barricade, returning fire when she could identify targets, but quickly realizing that her ammunition would not last long enough to make a significant difference in the outcome. The attackers had the advantages of numbers, position, and preparation. They could maintain sustained fire while she was forced to conserve every shot, could coordinate their movements while she remained trapped in an increasingly damaged shelter. Most critically, they could afford patience while her situation grew more desperate with each passing minute. As her ammunition dwindled and the cabin filled with smoke from burning debris ignited by muzzle flashes, Emma began to accept that Martha Wells had been right about the probable outcome of this confrontation. She would not survive to see another sunrise, would not have the opportunity to make peace with her choices or bid farewell to the life she had tried so desperately to preserve. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Emma found herself thinking not of defeat, but of the dignity with which Running Bear had faced his own mortality. He had been prepared to die with honor rather than live with shame, and she realized that her own choices had been guided by similar principles. Whatever happened now, she had acted according to her conscience rather than her fears. The gunfire suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed more threatening than the previous violence. Emma used the respite to reload her rifle. Though she had only 3 rounds remaining, hardly enough to make a meaningful stand against the force arrayed against her. "Mrs. Clarke," Henley called out, his voice carrying a note of false concern. "It doesn't have to end this way. Surrender now, and we'll make sure you receive fair treatment." Emma almost admired the audacity of the lie. Fair treatment from men who had just spent 10 minutes trying to kill her was hardly a credible offer, but she supposed they needed to maintain some pretense of legitimacy for their own consciences. "I think I'll stay where I am," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Then you're choosing to die for nothing," Morrison shouted. "That redskin lover ain't coming back to save you, and nobody else gives a damn what happens to a traitor." The words stung because they contained enough truth to wound. Emma was indeed alone, cut off from help, facing enemies who outnumbered and outgunned her. But Morrison's crude assessment missed something essential about her situation, something that Running Bear would have understood immediately. She was not dying for nothing. She was dying for the principle that kindness should not be punished, that mercy should not be branded as treason, that human decency should transcend the artificial boundaries that divided people into categories of acceptable and unacceptable. If these men killed her for those beliefs, at least she would die knowing that her life had meant something more than mere survival. The silence stretched longer, and Emma began to wonder if her attackers were planning some new approach to the problem she represented. Perhaps they were positioning themselves for a final assault, or perhaps they were simply enjoying the psychological torture of prolonged anticipation. Either way, she used the time to make her peace with whatever came next. That was when she heard it, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, a sound that made her heart leap with hope she had thought permanently extinguished. Hoofbeats, many of them, approaching from the north with the disciplined rhythm of trained cavalry. But these were not territorial soldiers coming to restore order. These were riders who moved with the fluid grace of people born to the saddle, whose approach carried none of the mechanical precision of military formations. The gunfire that erupted around her cabin now came from a completely different direction, catching Henley's men in the crossfire they had planned for her. Emma heard shouts of confusion and alarm as her attackers suddenly found themselves outnumbered and outflanked by an enemy they had not anticipated. Through her shattered window, she could see muzzle flashes blooming in the darkness like deadly flowers, could hear the distinctive war cries that announced the arrival of Cheyenne warriors seeking to honor their obligations to a woman who had shown kindness to one of their own. The battle was brief but decisive. Henley's men, however prepared they might have been for overwhelming a single isolated woman, were not equipped to face seasoned warriors fighting on familiar terrain under cover of darkness. The sounds of combat moved steadily away from Emma's cabin as the attackers found themselves driven back, their positions overrun by enemies who materialized from the night like avenging spirits. When silence finally returned, it carried a different quality than before. The satisfied quiet of justice delivered rather than the ominous stillness of approaching violence. Emma remained crouched behind her barricade, uncertain whether the danger had truly passed or if this was merely a temporary reprieve in a longer conflict. A familiar voice called her name from outside, and Emma felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she recognized Running Bear's distinctive accent. He was alive, healed enough to fight, and he had honored his promise to protect her, despite the obvious risks to himself and his people. Emma Clarke, you are safe now. The debt has been paid. Emma emerged from her cabin to find her property transformed into something resembling a battlefield. Several of Henley's men lay motionless in positions that suggested they had been caught completely by surprise, while others had apparently fled into the night, rather than face continued combat with enemies who had proven far more formidable than expected. Running Bear approached on foot, his movements still careful, but no longer hampered by the injuries that had brought him to her creek. Behind him, 24 Cheyenne warriors maintained watch over the surrounding area, their presence both protective and deeply symbolic of the bonds that had been forged through her act of compassion. "How did you know?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Chief White Eagle kept his word," Running Bear replied. "Our scouts have watched over you since my departure. When we saw these men gathering, preparing for attack, we knew the time had come to honor our obligations." Emma looked around at the aftermath of the battle, at the evidence of violence that had erupted from her simple decision to care for an injured stranger. She thought of Thomas Henley, who had fled with his surviving men, but would undoubtedly return with greater force and legal authority. She thought of the territorial government, which would not tolerate open warfare between white settlers and Indian tribes regardless of the justification. "This will bring more trouble," she said. "They'll use this as an excuse to send the army to claim that the Cheyenne are hostile and dangerous." Running Bear nodded gravely. "Perhaps, but some debts must be paid regardless of consequences. You saved my life at great risk to yourself. We could do no less for you." Chief White Eagle approached then, his bearing as dignified as Emma remembered from their previous encounter. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of formal ceremony, suggesting that what was happening transcended the immediate crisis. "Emma Clarke, you have proven yourself worthy of Cheyenne protection, but we recognize that our presence here brings you new dangers from your own people. Therefore, we offer you a choice." Emma waited, sensing that whatever came next would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life. "You may come with us, live among our people as an honored member of our tribe. You will want for nothing, and you will be protected by the strength of the Cheyenne nation. Or you may remain here, and we will continue to watch over you as we are able, though we cannot guarantee your safety against the forces your own people may bring to bear." The offer was generous beyond anything Emma could have imagined, but it also represented the complete abandonment of everything she had fought to preserve. Her land, her home, her identity as an independent woman carving out her own destiny, all would be lost if she accepted Cheyenne protection by joining their community permanently. "There's a third choice," she said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "I could leave this place voluntarily, start fresh somewhere else where the events here won't follow me." "Yes," White Eagle agreed. "That path is also open to you, but know that wherever you go, you carry with you the respect and protection of the Cheyenne people. We do not forget those who have honored us with their kindness." Emma looked around her property one final time, taking inventory of everything she would be leaving behind. The cabin where she had nursed Robert through his final illness, the grave beneath the oak tree where she had laid him to rest, the small victories and daily struggles that had defined her existence for the past year. All of it would remain here while she began again in some distant place, carrying only memories and the hard-won knowledge that compassion could create connections stronger than fear or hatred. But she also realized that staying would mean living under constant threat, never knowing when Henley or men like him would return with superior force and legal authority. The Cheyenne could not protect her indefinitely without risking their own survival in an increasingly hostile territory. The choice, when viewed clearly, was between preserving her physical location and preserving her life and principles. And, when framed in those terms, the decision became surprisingly clear. Emma stood in the pre-dawn silence, her decision crystallizing like frost on autumn grass. The weight of leaving everything behind pressed against her chest. But beneath that, pain lay something unexpected: relief. For the first time in months, she felt free from the constant vigilance that had defined her existence, liberated from the exhausting effort of defending what others were determined to take. "I'll go," she said quietly, the words carrying across the still air to where Chief White Eagle and Running Bear waited. "But not with you. I need to find my own path, make my own way." White Eagle nodded with the understanding of someone who recognized the necessity of such independence. "This shows wisdom. A person transplanted to foreign soil may survive, but one who chooses their own ground will flourish." Running Bear stepped forward, reaching into a leather pouch that hung from his belt. When his hand emerged, it held something that caught the moonlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. A small object that seemed to contain fire within its crystalline structure. "Before you depart," he said, his voice carrying the formal cadences Emma had learned to recognize as ceremonial speech. "Accept this token of our gratitude. It belonged to my grandmother, who taught me to see truth in people's hearts." Emma extended her palm, and Running Bear placed within it a pendant carved from what appeared to be a single piece of translucent stone. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, depicting a bear and eagle intertwined in a design that seemed to shift and flow as she moved it in the light. The leather cord from which it hung was worked with beadwork in patterns that told a story she couldn't read but somehow understood. "It's beautiful," she whispered, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gift, "but I can't accept something so precious." "You must," Running Bear insisted. By our customs, a life debt can only be settled when the one who gave aid accepts acknowledgement of their deed. Without this, I remain bound by obligation that can never be fulfilled." Emma understood that refusing would dishonor both of them, would render meaningless the cultural protocols that had brought these warriors to her defense. She slipped the cord over her head, feeling the pendant settle against her chest with a warmth that seemed to radiate from within the stone itself. "There is more," Chief White Eagle said, gesturing to several of his warriors who had remained mounted at the edge of the firelight. "Running Bear's life was worth much to our people. Custom demands that we offer compensation equal to the value of what was preserved." The warriors rode forward, leading behind them a string of horses that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. Even in the uncertain light, she could see that these were magnificent animals, their coats gleaming with health, their bearing proud and spirited. They moved with the fluid grace of creatures bred for both beauty and endurance, each one worth more than Emma had ever possessed in her entire life. 20 horses, White Eagle announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone fulfilling a sacred obligation. "For the life of our war chief, for the honor you showed our people, for the courage you demonstrated in the face of enemies who would punish kindness with death." Emma stared at the approaching herd, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was being offered. 20 horses represented wealth beyond her wildest dreams, the foundation for a new life anywhere she chose to establish it. With such resources, she could travel to California and her sister, could purchase land in Oregon Territory, could begin again with advantages she had never dared imagine possible. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "All I did was bandage his wounds, give him shelter while he healed. Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Running Bear corrected gently. "Any decent person might have wished to do the same, but you alone chose to act despite the cost to yourself. That choice has earned more than gratitude. It has earned respect that will endure for generations." As the horses were brought closer, Emma began to distinguish individual animals within the herd. There was a magnificent black stallion whose intelligent eyes seemed to assess her with as much curiosity as she showed him. A pair of mares, one chestnut and one gray, moved together with the synchronized grace of longtime companions. Younger horses, their coats ranging from deep brown to pale gold, displayed the spirited energy of animals bred for both speed and endurance. "Each horse has been chosen specifically," White Eagle explained. "Some for riding, some for carrying burdens, some for breeding stock that will provide for your future needs. Together, they represent everything necessary to establish yourself wherever you choose to make your new home." Emma moved among the animals, marveling at their condition and temperament. These were not wild mustangs broken to saddle, but carefully trained horses accustomed to human partnership. Their calm acceptance of her presence spoke of patient training and gentle handling that contradicted every stereotype she had heard about Indian horse culture. The black stallion approached her with deliberate steps, extending his muzzle to investigate her scent. When she reached out tentatively to stroke his neck, he stood perfectly still, allowing the contact with the dignity of a king, accepting homage from a worthy subject. His name translates as Thunder Walker. Running Bear said, watching the interaction with obvious approval. "He was my personal mount before injury made riding difficult. He will serve you well, and his offspring will carry your legacy forward." Emma felt tears threatening as the full impact of their generosity settled upon her. These people, who had every reason to distrust white settlers who had suffered countless betrayals and broken promises, were offering her wealth and security beyond anything her own people had ever provided. The contrast between their honor and the treachery she had experienced from men like Thomas Henley struck her with overwhelming force. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying all her confusion and gratitude. "Why risk so much for someone you barely know?" Chief White Eagle's expression grew solemn, his eyes reflecting depths of experience Emma could only imagine. "Because kindness is the rarest treasure in a world that rewards cruelty. Because mercy shown to enemies demonstrates strength that cannot be defeated by weapons. Because your actions proved that the barriers between peoples exist only in minds poisoned by fear and hatred." Running Bear moved to stand beside his chief, his presence adding weight to the formal pronouncement. "You saw a wounded human being where others would have seen only an enemy. You chose healing over hatred, compassion over safety. Such choices echo through time, creating changes that extend far beyond their immediate consequences." As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in delicate shades of rose and gold, the time for departure arrived. Emma had gathered her few essential possessions, some clothing, her late husband's watch, the letters she had written but never sent, and the small Bible her mother had given her on her wedding day. Everything else would remain with the cabin, abandoned to whatever fate awaited undefended homesteads in this harsh territory. The Cheyenne warriors prepared to escort her to the territorial boundary, ensuring her safe passage beyond the reach of Henley's influence. From there, she would continue alone with her new wealth, free to choose whatever destination called to her spirit. As she mounted Thunderwalker, feeling the powerful muscles bunch beneath her, Emma experienced a sensation she had almost forgotten: hope. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future held possibility rather than mere endurance, adventure rather than survival. "Where will you go?" Running Bear asked as the escort party prepared to move out. Emma considered the question, her mind ranging over options that had been impossible just hours before. "West, I think. Maybe Oregon, maybe California. Somewhere. I can start fresh, where the past won't follow." "Whatever path you choose," Chief White Eagle said, "remember that you carry with you the friendship of the Cheyenne people. In any place, at any time, you need only speak our names and help will come if it is within our power to provide." The promise was both reassuring and humbling, a reminder that her simple act of compassion had created bonds that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. Emma realized that she was leaving Montana Territory not as a defeated refugee, but as someone who had discovered that humanity's capacity for kindness could overcome even the deepest divisions. The journey to the territorial boundary took most of the day, the escort moving at a steady pace that allowed Emma to gradually adjust to the rhythm of riding Thunderwalker. The stallion responded to her inexperienced handling with patient intelligence, seeming to understand that his new rider needed time to develop confidence in their partnership. As they rode, Emma found herself thinking not of what she was leaving behind, but of what lay ahead. The horses represented more than wealth. They were symbols of transformation, evidence that acts of simple decency could yield rewards beyond imagination. She thought of Running Bear's grandmother, whose pendant now rested against her heart, and wondered what wisdom that woman might have shared about the unexpected paths that kindness could open. When they reached the boundary marker that separated Montana Territory from Idaho, Chief White Eagle called a halt. This was as far as the escort would travel, the limit of their ability to provide protection without risking their own people's safety. Emma dismounted for the final farewells, her emotions a complex mixture of gratitude and anticipation. Running Bear approached her one last time, his expression carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them. "You saved more than a life when you found me by your creek," he said quietly. "You saved the possibility of understanding between peoples who have forgotten how to see each other as human. That gift will ripple outward in ways you may never know." Emma nodded, unable to trust her voice to remain steady. She remounted Thunderwalker and gathered the lead ropes of her new herd, feeling the weight of responsibility for creatures whose value extended far beyond their monetary worth. As she rode westward into the afternoon sun, Emma carried with her more than material wealth. She carried the knowledge that compassion could triumph over hatred, that kindness could bridge the deepest divisions, and that sometimes the most profound rewards came to those who acted according to their conscience rather than their fears. Behind her, the Cheyenne warriors watched until she disappeared beyond the horizon, their vigil a final testament to the bonds that had been forged in a small cabin beside Willow Creek. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also endless possibility, stretching toward a future where her act of simple human decency would continue to echo through generations, yet unborn. The pendant against her chest caught the light as she rode, its crystalline depths seeming to hold all the wisdom of Running Bear's grandmother, all the hope of Chief White Eagle's vision, all the promise of a world where understanding could overcome fear and kindness could transform enemies into family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.